There's thus a strange, unsettling truth we don't instead often say aloud. The people who seem most thoughtful, most capable of deep moral reflection, the ones who could guide a new generation wisely, were increasingly choosing not to create one. This is not just a modern lifestyle choice or a statistical curiosity. It frames a deeper paradox that shakes the foundations of our understanding of human progress. Charles Darwin believed that evolution favors traits that enhance survival and reproduction. And yet here we are, living in a world where intelligence, education, self-awareness, traits we typically celebrate, often correlate with having fewer or even no children at all. Why? Why would qualities like wisdom, empathy, and critical thinking, which supposedly lead to the betterment of humanity, be linked to a decision that seemingly removes those individuals from the genetic future? There's a moral tension here. On one hand, thoughtful people often feel a heavy responsibility. They do not bring life into the world casually. They reflect on climate change, psychological trauma, social decay, and economic instability. They hesitate. They question. Meanwhile, those who act without much reflection can pass on their lives more easily, perhaps even carelessly. This creates a hidden evolutionary riddle and potentially a spiritual crisis. Are we watching the self-selected disappearance of the very people who care the most? Thinkers like Schopenhauer, who believed life is filled with suffering and that procreation is an act of ego, and Plato, who imagined a philosopher-king class too noble for ordinary rule, both pointed to this tension between intelligence and the continuation of life. In this video, we'll explore 6 core insights drawn from philosophy, psychology, and human history that may help us understand why this pattern exists and what it means for the future of humanity. But more importantly, we'll ask whether this paradox is a curse or a hidden invitation to redefine what it means to pass something on. It often begins quietly. A thoughtful young person stands by a window, watching a world that feels both wondrous and wounded. They read the news, see images of war, environmental collapse, children suffering. They feel it all a little too deeply, as if their empathy is both a gift and a burden. In that space of awareness, a question forms: how could I bring a child into all of this? Arthur Schopenhauer believed that to will life is to will suffering. For him, the very act of procreation was a kind of moral oversight, an ego-driven decision to perpetuate a cycle of pain. While his view was extreme, modern psychological research confirms that highly empathetic and intelligent people are more attuned to global threats, structural injustices, and existential risks. They don't shield themselves from the darkness, and in that exposure, the idea of parenthood feels less like a default path and more like a moral dilemma. The irony is that it's often precisely those who could parent with kindness and depth who hesitate the most. They see the suffering not just abstractly, but intimately. They're not distracted. They notice things, and that noticing becomes a weight, a kind of conscience. There's a quiet tragedy in this, because historically, it was often the wisest among us who became the teachers, mentors, and guides of the next generation. But today, as modernity delivers an endless stream of catastrophe through our screens, the empathetic mind can become paralyzed, seeing the world not as a playground for new life, but as a battlefield where innocence is inevitably lost. Evolutionary biology tells us that survival of the species depends on reproduction, not reflection. Yet psychological evolution pushes some humans toward greater consciousness, a consciousness that questions whether survival alone is enough. In that questioning, the biological impulse is interrupted by a philosophical one. Should I? One might argue that if empathy leads to non-reproduction, then empathy is maladaptive in evolutionary terms. But here is the paradox. Empathy is also what makes us human, what makes civilization possible. The very tenderness that makes someone hesitate to bring a child into the world is the same tenderness we desperately need more of. The world may not suffer from a lack of population, but from a lack of conscience. When a highly sensitive person contemplates parenthood, they often think not, "Can I afford a child? But what if my child suffers depression? What if the planet collapses? What if I pass down my trauma?" These are not neurotic questions. They are deeply ethical, and yet the burden of them can become so heavy that the decision never arrives, only avoidance. The philosopher Simone Weil once wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." Perhaps those who are most attentive to the world's pain believe they are being generous by not imposing life onto another. But what if that generosity is incomplete? What if attention to suffering must also be paired with a form of creative hope? This is the central tension of this first insight. Seeing clearly can both paralyze and awaken us. It can lead to moral caution or moral leadership. The very people who don't want to bring life into a world of suffering might be the same ones who could raise a child who alleviates it. But they must first resolve the inner question: is avoiding life a form of wisdom or an abdication of responsibility? And so we end with a quiet realization: the clearer our vision of the world, the more painful the idea of continuation becomes. But perhaps clarity is not meant to prevent life, but to prepare us to guide it with deeper awareness. Imagine a brilliant young professional in a gleaming city, degrees on the wall, deadlines on the screen, a mind constantly wired to solve, optimize, outperform. They are praised for productivity, intelligence, ambition. But beneath that polished competence lies a fraying inner world, anxiety, stress, a haunting sense of isolation. They can build a business plan, but struggle to build a calm evening. They can solve problems for others, but not the ache in their own chest. This is the second paradox. The modern world celebrates intellect. It is the golden ticket. Yet the very environments that cultivate high intelligence often erode the psychological stability required for nurturing a child. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that modernity fragments the soul, that in the pursuit of efficiency and rational progress, we lose connection to instinct, ritual, meaning. We become clever, but brittle, smart, but spiritually exhausted. And when someone who is already burdened by existential fatigue contemplates parenthood, the question isn't, "Do I want this?" but "Am I even psychologically equipped?" We live in a culture of burnout. Intelligent people are often the most sensitive to it, hyper-aware of expectations, drowning in information, unable to rest. Emotional regulation becomes a struggle. Sleep is poor, relationships strained. Parenting requires patience, gentleness, presence. But the modern intellectual environment rewards the opposite: constant motion, self-optimization, abstraction. In the past, community structures buffered the pressures of raising a child. Extended families, village life, shared responsibilities. Now, Highly intelligent individuals move to big cities, away from family, chasing careers. They become isolated, and isolation is emotionally violent in subtle ways. The smarter they are, the more they understand the impact of trauma, neglect, overstimulation. They fear passing that instability on. And so, many abstain not out of selfishness, but an almost tragic self awareness. I might not be whole enough to nurture someone else. Psychology calls this anticipatory guilt, the fear of harming a future child by not being emotionally prepared. It's not a lack of desire, but a surplus of caution. Intelligent people see their own anxiety like a mirror. If I bring a child into this, I may pass this fragmentation onward. And so, they wait. Years pass. The window narrows. The intellect thrives. The possibility of life quietly recedes. There's also a deeper pain. Society often uses smart people as instruments for profit, innovation, advancement, but rarely teaches them how to live deeply. They become high-functioning, low-nourished. The very skills that make them valuable in the marketplace, critical thinking, skepticism, perfectionism, become obstacles when trying to embrace the messy, imperfect, emotional chaos of raising a child. Nietzsche might say, the modern intellectual becomes a tightrope walker, suspended between the animalistic past and a future ideal, never fully grounded in either. Too thoughtful to live instinctually, too instinctual to live purely in the abstract. Parenthood, which once felt natural, now feels like a risk analysis equation mixed with existential dread. But here's the hidden truth. Emotional stability is not a prerequisite for parenthood. It is sometimes the very result of it. Some people only grow more grounded once they are needed by someone else. Responsibility can mature the soul, but this requires a leap of faith. And faith is something the analytical mind often forfeits. So the question forms, is the modern intelligent person actually unfit for parenthood? Or have they been conditioned to believe that perfection must precede creation? Somewhere between burnout and longing, we find a painful impasse. The mind races ahead, while the heart waits in silence. And so we end this insight with a reflective tension. In a world that rewards intellect, but not inner peace, the smartest among us may feel least prepared to nurture life, not because they lack love, but because they doubt their ability to give it consistently. They ask, perhaps silently, am I emotionally whole enough to guide another soul, or has modern life sharpened my mind at the cost of my capacity to love steadily? There's a peculiar moment that happens in thoughtful people's lives. They intend to decide, one day, they'll think about children after the next promotion, after they feel more secure, after they've healed from their trauma. What begins as a responsible postponement eventually becomes a permanent state, delay as a way of life. Søren Kierkegaard wrote about the individual who lives in the infinite, lost in possibilities, terrified of choosing one path because choice means sacrifice. He called it the dizziness of freedom. Intelligent individuals, with their capacity to see multiple perspectives, often fall victim to this. They can see 10 possible futures, 10 potential pitfalls, 10 ways they could fail a child. So they wait. At first, waiting feels wise. It is rational to want stability before parenthood, but life rarely aligns in perfect stability, and years slip quietly through the cracks of rational planning. By the time someone feels ready, biology is less ready, and so destiny is shaped not by a decisive rejection of parenthood, but by 1,000 small delays. Psychologists call this temporal discounting, the tendency to favor short-term certainty over long-term reward, especially when the long term feels uncertain. A meaningful life with a child is a long arc, a restful night, a stable income, a quiet apartment are immediate, and intelligent people, acutely aware of time and risk, often choose the certainty of the present over the uncertainty of future joy. There's also the cultural narrative. You have time. In their 20s, brilliant young people are told to build their career first. In their 30s, they are told to build financial security. By their late 30s, the tone shifts. Now there is anxiety. The clock they once ignored suddenly ticks loudly. What was once a choice becomes a crisis. Delay is not merely logistical, it's psychological. The more someone delays a major life change, the more ingrained their current identity becomes. If they spend a decade cultivating independence, solitude, intellectual life, the thought of restructuring all of that for a child feels like an existential upheaval. Their sense of self has formed around not having children, even if they never meant it to. This doesn't come from selfishness. It comes from a deep desire to be fully prepared, emotionally, financially, spiritually. But Kierkegaard warns us, to dare is to lose one's footing momentarily. Not to dare is to lose oneself. The thoughtful person spends so much time securing a safe footing that they end up losing the very possibility of the life they quietly hoped for. There's a sad irony here. Many intelligent people do want children. One day, they imagine being a wise, attentive parent. They dream of passing down lessons learned, of raising a child with depth and care. But they also want to avoid harm, to avoid mistakes, to avoid bringing a child into uncertainty. So they wait and wait until the waiting becomes a quiet no. So we find ourselves at a crossroads. Is caution protecting us, or is it stealing our chance to love in a new way? At what point does reflection become avoidance? The philosopher would say, you cannot think your way into life. At some point, you must step into it. And so this insight ends with a haunting recognition. Delay feels harmless, but it is deeply consequential. It is not just a pause, it is a path. Those who reflect deeply often delay, and delay becomes destiny. And we must ask ourselves, what are we postponing in the name of being ready? And are we ready to live with that postponement forever? Consider a man who has mapped out his life with surgical precision, career milestones, financial goals, personal health routines. He can predict his week down to the hour. He prides himself on control. Parenthood, however, is uncontrollable, a force of nature. No spreadsheet can prepare him for midnight cries, emotional upheaval, the unpredictability of love. And so he hesitates, waiting for a perfect moment that rationality insists must exist, but nature never intended. Sigmund Freud believed that much of human life is driven not by rational planning, but by unconscious instincts, forces that propel us into love, attachment, desire, legacy. Evolutionary biology supports this. Human beings are wired to reproduce through emotional bonding, impulsive attraction, biological readiness, not through intellectual deliberation. In other words, nature expects life to happen through impulse, not through meticulous planning. The modern rational thinker, however, tries to subdue instinct with intellect. They suppress the natural flow of life until it aligns with their calculated timeline. They schedule love. They weigh every risk. They eliminate chaos. Parenthood is chaos, so it gets postponed indefinitely until the biological window quietly closes. There's a cold efficiency to this. Rational planning protects us from disaster. It enables long-term achievement, but it also disconnects us from the primal forces that make us human. Carl Jung said that what we repress returns in distorted form. If we repress instinct too long, it may return as regret, emptiness, or a midlife crisis, the sudden realization that life was never meant to be perfectly controlled, only courageously inhabited. Many intelligent adults admit privately they expected the feeling of wanting children to arrive suddenly, unmistakably, as if some inner switch would flip, but rational minds often override that quiet instinct. They demand reasons, schedules, proof, and instinct does not speak that language. It whispers, it nudges. If ignored long enough, it grows silent. Meanwhile, others, perhaps less analytical, simply follow their heart or embrace an unplanned pregnancy. They stumble into parenthood and discover meaning through it. They didn't plan, and yet life unfolded. The rational observer watches, skeptical but secretly wondering if all their intellectual caution has carved out a life too narrow for something as wild and meaningful as raising a child. Freud would argue that the urge for legacy, for continuation, is rooted in the unconscious desire to transcend death, to live on through another. Rationality dismisses this as sentimental, but psychological research shows that many child-free individuals later experience a sharp existential loneliness, not because they lack company, but because they lack continuation. They have mastered time, but lost a sense of timelessness. This doesn't mean everyone must follow instinct blindly. It means that life's deepest transformations often come not from plans, but from surrender, surrendering to love, to responsibility, to the unknown. Intelligent people often ask, will a child fit into my life? Nature rarely asks that. It simply moves, creates, begins. Life arrives, and we adapt. So the question becomes, has our rational mind become a gatekeeper that locks out the very experiences that could soften and deepen us? Is planning our way of avoiding the vulnerability of being overwhelmed? And if so, what might we be losing? We end this insight with a quiet turn. Life may never give us perfect conditions for parenthood. It may ask us to step in before we feel ready. Instinct doesn't wait for logic's approval. And perhaps part of growing wiser is recognizing when to stop planning and start living. Picture the idealized images shared online. A glowing mother cradling her child beneath soft sunlight, or a proud father laughing on a picnic blanket. Social media, advertisements, and cultural narratives celebrate parenthood as the pinnacle of meaning and joy. Yet, behind these images lies a quieter truth. Modern parents often feel desperately alone. An intelligent, reflective person sees this. They know the difference between symbolic praise and lived support. They recognize that society may honor the idea of having children, but it rarely offers the structures that make raising children truly sustainable. The nuclear family has replaced the village. The village has been replaced by screens. Emil Durkheim warned that as societies modernize, social bonds weaken, people become more individualistic, isolated, deprived of communal support. For someone contemplating parenthood, this reality is not theoretical, it's pragmatic. Who will help me? Who will be there at 3 a.m. when I'm breaking down? Many see the loneliness that parents quietly carry and choose to spare themselves that solitude. Michel Foucault would argue that modern institutions praise certain choices publicly, but abandon individuals privately. Parenting becomes one of those institutions, celebrated yet unsupported. Intelligent individuals perceive that contradiction. They won't be fooled by sentimental slogans. They know that love alone cannot overcome systemic isolation. It isn't that they don't value family. Often they value it so much that they refuse to engage in it half-heartedly. They see parenthood not as a poetic symbol, but as a daily, relentless endeavor. They imagine the child who needs presence, patience, community, and they look at their own lives, often lived far from relatives, with demanding jobs and limited time, and wonder, would I be condemning myself and the child to a life of struggle and emotional hunger? And yet, this insight also reveals something profound. It suggests that the problem isn't that wise people don't want children. It's that the world they live in no longer supports the village mindset that once made parenthood a shared communal calling. When the communal disappears, the weight falls on the individual, and the individual, no matter how intelligent or loving, feels the crushing solitude. Studies have shown that in nations with strong social support systems, educated people are more likely to have children. That's not intelligence that prevents parenthood. It's isolation. The wiser someone is, the more clearly they see this hidden truth, and they refuse to be trapped by an illusion. But there's a quiet opportunity buried in this revelation. If thoughtful people withdraw from parenthood because the social fabric is torn, then perhaps their role is not only to raise children, but to rebuild the fabric, to recreate community, to foster connection, to model a different way of living. Some are already doing this, forming intentional communities, sharing childcare across families, redefining kinship. Still, for many, the romantic image of parenthood cannot outweigh the realistic fear of isolation. They say, I would love to raise a child, but not alone. This is not selfishness. This is honesty. And honesty, in a way, is a form of love, refusing to bring life into a world unprepared to support it. So we end this insight with a double-edged truth. Intelligent people often reject the illusion of glorified parenthood because they see the hidden loneliness behind it. And yet, that very clarity could inspire them to create the communal structures that make parenthood deeply human again, if they choose to engage, not in sentiment, but in solidarity. There's a quieter kind of legacy, not of ancestry, but of influence. Some of the most profound individuals in history never had biological children. Jesus, Nietzsche, Florence Nightingale, Immanuel Kant. Their ideas, their compassion, their courage, these became their offspring. It raises the question, could it be that some people are called not to propagate genes, but to cultivate souls? Plato spoke of a higher form of reproduction, giving birth to ideas in the minds of others. He believed that the philosopher's role was to nourish the collective consciousness, shaping the world through wisdom rather than lineage. Carl Jung similarly spoke of individuation, becoming a complete self so that one can transmit psychic truths to others. In this view, parenthood can take many forms: mentoring, teaching, writing, healing. For the highly thinking, deeply feeling individual, this insight brings both comfort and disquiet. Comfort, because it validates the genuine impact of their existence even without children. Disquiet because it begs the question, is this a rationalization or a genuine calling? Are they avoiding parenthood out of fear, or have they been chosen by life for a different kind of transmission? Psychologists call this symbolic immortality, the feeling that we live on through our contributions, our ideas, our influence. Many child-free intellectuals pour their energy into creating something meaningful that lasts, and often that creation shapes future generations more broadly than one could through a single biological lineage. Yet there is a hidden melancholy here too, because no matter how profound our ideas might be, they cannot hold our hand in old age. They cannot laugh with us across a dinner table. They cannot offer the intimate, embodied continuity that families often provide. Ideas are powerful, but they are not warm. Wisdom is immortal, but it is not a child's hug. So where does that leave the wise? Perhaps the real invitation is integration, to realize that passing down wisdom does not have to replace biological legacy, and that biological legacy does not have to be the sole measure of impact. The modern thinker, however, faced with emotional exhaustion, existential fear, and cultural isolation, may choose to invest in the realm where they feel most competent, thought, not family. But in doing so, there is a danger. The human race may inherit progress and knowledge while losing the very people who could embody that knowledge in the next generation. If the kindest, most reflective individuals exit the genetic pool, what kind of future beings are we cultivating? And yet, perhaps we must see this differently. Every mentor, every writer, every teacher who shapes a young mind is participating in parenthood. Many who do not have children biologically end up shaping dozens, even hundreds of lives indirectly. This is not a consolation prize. It is a real form of generativity. Still, we end with a question. Is wisdom alone enough to sustain the human story, or does the world need both wisdom and blood, both the mind and the continuation of life to carry it forward? The sixth insight leaves us with a haunting but hopeful thought. Maybe the destiny of the thinker is not to choose one legacy over another, but to awaken the world to the fact that legacy itself can take many shapes, and that the ultimate form of reproduction is the creation of meaning in the hearts of others. We began with a troubling paradox. Why do the most thoughtful, reflective people, those who might guide a future generation wisely, so often choose not to create one? Along this journey, we explored 6 profound insights that reveal this is not a shallow trend, but a deep spiritual and psychological phenomenon in our age. We saw that those who perceive the world's suffering most clearly often hesitate to bring a child into it, not from apathy, but from conscience. We acknowledged how modern life rewards intellect, yet erodes the inner stability a child needs. We watched how delay, born from reflection, quietly hardens into destiny. We explored how our rational obsession with planning can suffocate the instincts through which life truly arrives. We confronted the reality that culture glorifies parenthood symbolically while abandoning parents in practice, and how the wise can see through the illusion. And finally, we faced the possibility that for some the true legacy may not be biological, but spiritual, passing down wisdom rather than blood. These are not excuses. They are real energies shaping a generation, and now, having walked through them honestly, we arrive at a deeper clarity. The question is not strictly about whether smart people should or shouldn't have children. The real question is what kind of life the thoughtful person is meant to bring forth, and in what form. Some may indeed feel called to raise children, and perhaps, even without perfect conditions, they must take that leap, understanding that responsibility does not wait for readiness. Others may devote themselves to ideas, art, mentorship, healing, leaving a legacy that may not carry their DNA, but carries their consciousness. But here is the truth. The world needs the thoughtful to remain engaged, biologically, culturally, spiritually, because if those who care the most about truth, beauty, justice, or compassion remove themselves from the unfolding of the human story, that story will be written by those who don't. So whether one chooses to raise a child or to channel their energy into shaping younger minds and hearts in other ways, the demand is the same: do not disappear. Do not bow out. Do not let caution become silence or avoidance become legacy by default. Step forward into life, into mentorship, into creation, even if imperfectly. The evolutionary paradox remains, but perhaps evolution itself, cultural, spiritual, moral evolution, requires a new kind of participation, passing down not just life, but wisdom. And maybe the most powerful future is one where the thoughtful both raise children and raise consciousness, refusing the false divide between biology and meaning. So ask yourself, how will I participate in the long story of humanity? What do I refuse to let die with me? What will I choose to pass on, whether through blood or through spirit? If this exploration resonated with you, I invite you to stay in this conversation. Subscribe if you haven't already, not just as a number, but as a fellow thinker in this quiet community. Share your reflections below, because this isn't just content, it's a shared journey toward a wiser world.